At some point, usually without a clear beginning, you may notice that not everything reaches you in the same way anymore. Some ideas land immediately, others pass by unnoticed. Some patterns feel obvious, while others seem invisible, even though you know they must exist. This isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with a signal or a feeling of importance. It's quieter than that, and yet once you notice it, it becomes difficult to ignore, not because it demands attention, but because it reveals something subtle about how observation itself works. Most of what exists is not directly experienced. This isn't a belief. It's a practical reality. Your environment is filled with signals, information, rhythms, and variations that never fully register. Not because they're hidden and not because they're forbidden, but because attention is selective by nature. You are always observing, but you are never observing everything. And the reasons behind what is noticed versus what is not are more interesting than they first appear. It's worth saying this early. Noticing certain frequencies does not make you special, chosen, or ahead of others. Observation is not hierarchy. It's a process. And processes respond to conditions, not identity. What you notice today may have been invisible to you before. What feels obvious to you now may remain unnoticed by someone else, not because they lack ability, but because their attention is currently tuned elsewhere. This is normal. It's how systems manage complexity. Consider how hearing works. At any given moment, countless sound waves move through the space around you. Only a narrow band registers as audible, not because the others don't exist, but because your auditory system filters them out. If it didn't, the result wouldn't be expanded awareness, it would be noise. The same principle applies to perception, cognition, and awareness itself. Observation depends on filtering. Without it, meaning collapses. When people talk about frequency in an abstract sense, it's easy to imagine something mystical or exaggerated. But frequency at its most basic level simply refers to patterns of repetition and variation over time. Light has frequency. Sound has frequency. Thoughts, behaviors, conversations, even cultural trends follow frequency-like patterns. Some repeat constantly. Others appear briefly and fade. Observation happens where repetition intersects with relevance. What determines relevance isn't fixed. It shifts with context, experience, and internal state. You don't observe the same things at every stage of life, not because the world changes entirely, but because your filters do. When responsibility increases, attention reorganizes. When curiosity sharpens, perception follows. When uncertainty appears, observation knows. None of this is good or bad. It is adaptive. Most frequencies go unnoticed because noticing them would offer no immediate value. Your mind, quite efficiently, prioritizes what helps you orient, respond, and function. This is why you can walk through a familiar space without consciously registering every detail. The information is there, but attention does linger. Observation is economical, yet sometimes something previously ignored begins to stand out. Not dramatically, more like a quiet pattern repeating just enough to be acknowledged. A certain type of conversation, a recurring idea, a rhythm in how events unfold. You don't chase it. You simply notice it appearing more often. This is not because the frequency suddenly appeared, but because your awareness has adjusted enough to include it. There is a common assumption that awareness expands through effort alone. In reality, it often expands through stability. When the mind is less reactive, it becomes more observant. When it is less occupied with immediate demands, it begins to register subtler patterns. This does require discipline in the dramatic sense. It is closer to availability, the capacity to notice without rushing to interpret. Observation doesn't always come with conclusions. In fact, the most reliable observations often arrive without them. You see something repeat, you notice a pattern, you recognize a shift, and you leave it there, unforced. This is uncomfortable for some people, because the mind prefers closure. But incomplete understanding is not a failure. It's a signal that perception is ahead of explanation. This is where many frequencies remain unobserved, not because they are inaccessible, but because they don't resolve quickly. They don't announce what they mean. They require patience, and patience is rarely encouraged. Most systems reward speed, clarity, and certainty. Observation operates differently. It rewards consistency, neutrality, and time. You might notice this in how people react to ambiguity. Some immediately assign meaning. Others dismiss it. Fewer simply observe it. Those who do aren't passive. They're gathering data without forcing a narrative. Over time, this allows patterns to reveal themselves naturally. Not all do, but enough do to justify the approach. There's also the factor of emotional filtering. Frequencies tied to discomfort, uncertainty, or challenge are often avoided. Not consciously, but through subtle disengagement. Attention slides away. This doesn't mean those frequencies disappear. It just means they remain unobserved. Over time, this can shape perception in noticeable ways. Entire categories of information become background noise. On the other side, frequencies confirm existing beliefs are noticed more readily. This is efficient, but limiting. Observation narrows when it only reinforces what is already known. Broad awareness requires tolerance for contradiction, not acceptance, just tolerance. The ability to let opposing signals exist without immediate resolution. None of this suggests that you should seek out every possible frequency. That would be impractical. The point is simpler. What you observe is not a measure of truth, importance, or value. It's a reflection of where attention currently rests. And attention is movable, even when it doesn't feel that way. Sometimes people describe moments where perception feels slightly clearer, quieter, or more spacious. These moments aren't necessarily profound. Often, they're ordinary. You're listening without preparing a response. You're watching without labeling. You're thinking without urgency. In those moments, different frequencies become available not because they arrived, but because the noise receded. This can happen while walking, reading, working, or even doing nothing in particular. There's no technique required. The common factor is reduced internal interference. When the mind stops competing with itself, observation becomes smoother, less effortful, more inclusive. What's interesting is that once a frequency is observed, it rarely disappears entirely. Even if attention moves on, the pattern has been registered. You may notice it again later, in a different context, with a slightly different understanding. Observation compounds, not linearly, but relationally. Each noticing adds context to the next. This is why forcing awareness rarely works. You can't command yourself to observe what your system isn't ready to process, but you can create conditions where observation becomes more likely. Calm, consistency, reduced urgency, neutral curiosity. These don't guarantee anything. They simply make space. And space matters more than intensity. High intensity narrows focus. Space widens it. This is why loud environments drown out subtle signals. The same applies internally. When thoughts are loud, patterns go unnoticed. When they soften, more becomes visible. You may already recognize this in small ways. Rereading something years later and noticing details you missed. Hearing a phrase that suddenly feels relevant. Realizing that something has been repeating quietly for a long time. These moments don't demand action, they invite consideration. And consideration doesn't need to end in answers. Sometimes, the value lies in holding the observation without resolution. Letting it remain incomplete. This is uncomfortable, but it's also where deeper understanding tends to form. Not as a conclusion, but as a gradual alignment between perception and meaning. More frequencies are not observed because they don't fit neatly into existing frameworks. They don't confirm expectation. They don't resolve quickly. They don't announce importance. They simply persist, quietly, waiting for the right conditions to be noticed. There's no rush. Observation isn't a race. It unfolds at the pace of readiness, not desire. And readiness is shaped by many factors: experience, rest, curiosity, stability, none of which can be forced without distortion. If you find yourself noticing more than you used to, that doesn't mean you've changed in some dramatic way. It likely means something has settled. Some internal noise has reduced. Some pressure has eased. And in that space, perception adjusted slightly. That adjustment doesn't need to be explained. It doesn't need to be shared. It doesn't need to lead anywhere. It can simply exist as an expanded field of noticing, a broader range of what registers. And if none of this resonates right now, that's also fine. Observation isn't constant. It comes and goes. Attention tightens and loosens. What matters isn't staying in one state, but recognizing that state shift naturally. As you continue listening, you may notice that some parts of this feel familiar, while others fade into the background. That's not accidental. It's your attention doing what it always does, selecting, filtering, prioritizing. Even now, frequencies are passing through that don't register. Others linger. You don't need to decide which matter. You don't need to act on them. Simply noticing that this process is happening is enough to change how future observation unfolds. Not immediately, gradually. And perhaps that's the part worth sitting with. That observation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't promise outcome. It simply becomes possible when conditions allow, quietly, naturally, without needing to be named. If this kind of exploration feels useful to you, if you find value in calm observation without pressure or conclusions, you may want to continue spending time in this space. Subscribing doesn't change anything directly. It just makes returning easier when curiosity brings you back. For now, there's nothing to do with what you've heard, no insight to apply, no message to decode, just the awareness that observation itself is selective, adaptive, and constantly shifting, and that most frequencies remain unobserved, not because they are hidden, but because attention is always quietly choosing. What it chooses next doesn't need to be decided yet.